crashed onto my neighbor's gazebo. How was I supposed to know that fighting back would expose a million-dollar fraud scheme and bring the FBI to our quiet suburban doorsteps? Comment below where you're watching from. Blood rushed to my head as I slammed on the brakes in my driveway. My beautiful maple tree, the one that had given my home perfect shade for 15 summers, was being hacked. Apart by men in orange vests, the chainsaw's roar filled the air as I jumped out of my car, heart pounding against my ribs. "Stop! What are you doing to my tree?" I shouted, running across my lawn. The workers paused, looking at each other with uncertainty. But a woman in a crisp white pantsuit marched toward me from next door. Karen Peterson, the self-appointed Queen of Sunshine. Acres, with her perfect blonde bob and permanent scowl. "Finally, someone's taking care of this nightmare," she said, arms crossed over her chest. "Your leaves clog my gutters every fall and the roots are cracking my driveway." I ignored her, approaching the man who seemed to be in charge. "This is my property." "Who authorized this?" "HOA approval, sir," he said, handing me a wrinkled paper with an official-looking stamp. Signed by Mr. Thornton himself. Richard Thornton, HOA president and Karen's golf buddy. I should have known. "I never got notice about this," I said, scanning the document with trembling hands. The letterhead looked legitimate, but something felt off. I'd paid my dues religiously for years, followed every ridiculous rule about trash cans and holiday decorations. "Notice was sent 2 weeks ago," Karen chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Maybe if you checked your mail more often." Just then my phone buzzed. A text from my elderly neighbor, Tom. "Saw the tree crew. Did they finally wear you down?" Tom had been fighting the HOA for years over his bird feeders. He understood. "This stops now," I declared, pulling out my phone to take pictures. "Until I verify this with the board." The crew chief shrugged. "Lady, we're just doing what we're paid for. Take it up with management." As I dialed Richard's number, a sickening crack split the air. One of the half-cut branches, a massive limb, thicker than my waist, was giving way. The workers scrambled backward as the enormous branch crashed down with a thunderous boom, right onto Karen's prized gazebo, the white lattice structure, the one she'd bragged about in 3 neighborhood newsletters, splintered. Like matchsticks, her prize-winning roses crushed beneath splintered wood and leaves. Karen's scream could have shattered windows. "My gazebo! Do you see what your tree did?" She pointed a manicured finger at me, face turning an alarming shade of red. "This is exactly why it needed to come down." The crew chief whistled low. "That's gonna be expensive." My phone call to Richard went straight to voicemail. "Of course it did." "This is your fault," Karen hissed, already tapping furiously on her phone. "Richard will hear about this immediately. You'll be paying for every penny of damage." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Your friend Richard authorized cutting my tree without my permission. If anyone's responsible for that branch falling, it's the people who weakened it by cutting it improperly." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We'll see what the board has to say about that." As if summoned by her fury, a sleek black SUV pulled up. Richard Thornton stepped out, his golf tan contrasting with his white polo shirt, a clipboard already in hand. "I got your text, Karen," he said, not even looking my way. "Oh my, that's quite a mess." "Richard," I said, stepping into his line of sight, "your crew is cutting down my tree without my consent." He finally acknowledged me with a thin smile. "As per HOA Bylaw 7.2, trees deemed hazardous can be removed at the board's discretion. We've had 3 complaints about this maple." "3? Let me guess. Karen, you and your wife?" I crossed my arms. "Show me where in the HOA agreement it says you can enter private property without notice." Richard's smile didn't waver. Notice was sent. And now we have property damage that proves our point about safety concerns. I felt trapped in some bizarre nightmare. "The damage happened because your crew started cutting it!" "The tree was perfectly healthy." "That's not how the report will read," Karen interjected, smugly taking photos of her destroyed gazebo from multiple angles. I noticed neighbors peeking through windows and stepping onto porches. This was becoming the show of the week. Tom was now standing on his driveway, watching with concern. "Listen," Richard said, lowering his voice. "The tree is coming down one way or another. The board voted. If you fight this, we can make things very difficult. HOA fines can add up quickly." The threat hung in the air between us. I'd heard stories of people losing their homes over HOA disputes, but I never thought it would happen to me. "I'm calling my lawyer," I said, pulling out my phone again. Richard shrugged. "Do what you need to do. But that gazebo repair bill will be coming your way regardless." As they walked away, I heard Karen say, "I told you he'd be difficult, just like with the bird bath last year." The tree crew looked uncomfortable. "Do we continue?" one asked. "No," I said firmly. "Not today." I spent the evening researching HOA laws and taking photos of every angle of my property. The partially cut tree looked wounded, its exposed inner rings pale against the dark bark. When I checked my mail, which I admittedly hadn't done in several days due to a work trip, there was indeed a notice, dated yesterday. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Around 3 a.m., a strange noise woke me, a car door closing. I peered through the blinds, just in time to see Richard's SUV pulling away from the curb. What was he doing here at this hour? The mystery deepened the next morning when I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The HOA was suing me for $28,000 in damages to Karen's property. They had included photographs of the fallen branch and destroyed gazebo, along with a structural engineer's report dated 3 weeks ago claiming my tree was diseased and dangerous. 3 weeks ago? But Karen had only started complaining about it last month. Something didn't add up, and I had a sinking feeling this went deeper than just a tree and a broken gazebo. As I stared at the lawsuit papers, my phone rang. It was Tom. "I saw Richard sneaking around your yard last night," he said without preamble. "You need to check your property line. I think there's something about your land they want." My hands shook as I tore open the certified letter that had just arrived. The return address showed Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped before I even read a word. "We hereby inform you that legal action has been initiated against you in the amount of $28,000 for damages caused by your negligence." I nearly spit out my coffee. $28,000? For a tree they cut down without my permission? The letter claimed my failure to maintain hazardous vegetation led to catastrophic property damage to Mrs. Peterson's gazebo. There were color photos attached of her destroyed garden structure, along with repair estimates from Surprise, Richard Thornton's construction company. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Peterson herself. "I just wanted to make sure you received the HOA's letter," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "It's such a shame about my poor gazebo. My daughter was planning her wedding reception there next month." "Mrs. Peterson, your people cut down my tree without permission. How is this possibly my fault?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Well, if you had maintained your yard properly, none of this would have happened," she sniffed. "The board has documented 12 separate complaints about that eyesore. We were acting in the community's best interest." After I hung up, I paced around my kitchen, heart pounding. I couldn't afford a $28,000 payout or the lawyer to fight it. Was I going to lose my house over this? A knock at my door broke my panic spiral. It was Tom from 3 doors down holding a six-pack. "Heard about the tree situation," he said. "Figured you could use this." I invited him in, grateful for any friendly face. Tom had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, long before Richard Thornton became HOA president. "This isn't the first time they've pulled something like this," Tom said, settling onto my couch. "Last summer, the Johnsons got fined $500 because their mailbox was desert sand instead of coastal beige. The difference was barely noticeable, but Richard claimed it violated community standards." "How do they get away with this?" I asked. "Most people just pay up. It's easier than fighting," Tom shrugged. "Richard stacked the board with his friends. His construction company gets all the maintenance contracts. Mrs. Peterson's husband sits on the zoning board that approves Richard's development projects downtown. It's all connected." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw what happened to your tree. Check your property survey." A concerned neighbor. "Do you have your property documents?" Tom asked. "The ones from when you bought the house?" I dug through my filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Closing Documents. Inside was a thick stack of papers, including a detailed property survey I'd never really looked at before. Tom and I spread the papers across my dining table. The survey showed property lines, easements, and structures. My eyes landed on the maple tree's location, or where it had been. "Tom," I whispered, "look at this." The survey clearly marked the tree as being 2 feet inside my property line, not on the HOA common area as Richard had claimed. A sticky note from my real estate agent even highlighted it as a valuable mature tree that adds to property value. "They had no right to touch it," Tom said. "The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over trees fully on private property." I felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by anger. They knew, they must have known. I took photos of the survey with my phone and started searching online for HOA tree removal disputes. The search results were eye-opening. There were forums filled with similar stories, news articles about lawsuits, and even specialized attorneys who handled nothing but HOA conflicts. At midnight, as Tom was leaving, he paused at the door. "Be careful," he warned. "Richard doesn't like losing." When the Morales family challenged a violation last year, someone slashed their tires the next day. No proof it was connected, of course. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the scene of coming home to find strangers cutting down my tree. The arrogance of Richard standing there, with his clipboard. Mrs. Peterson, watching from her yard with that smug smile. At 3 a.m., I started drafting a response letter. By dawn, I had created a folder with photos of the tree before cutting, After cutting the damage to the gazebo, my property survey, and printouts of the HOA bylaws I'd found online. Section 7.3 clearly stated, the association shall not remove or significantly alter any mature trees on private property without written consent of the homeowner. Around 8 a.m., my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Peterson again, this time with a plate of muffins. I felt terrible about our conversation yesterday, she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. I thought maybe we could discuss a payment plan for the damages. I know $28,000 is a lot all at once. I looked at her perfectly coiffed hair, designer outfit, and the Mercedes parked in my driveway. This woman didn't care about me or my tree. This was about power and control. Actually, Mrs. Peterson, I've been reviewing my property documents, I said calmly. It seems there's been a mistake. That tree was fully on my private property, which means the HOA had no authority to cut it down. Her smile vanished. Well, I'm sure Richard had proper approval. From whom? I interrupted. The tree was on my property. I never gave permission. In fact, according to Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, what happened might actually be considered destruction of private property. Mrs. Peterson's face hardened. You really don't want to make enemies here. We've built a nice community with nice property values. Nobody wants a troublemaker. As she walked away, my phone pinged with an email. The subject line made my blood run cold, urgent. Line notice, Oak Ridge Estates HOA. They were putting a lien on my house for the unpaid damages. Could they really take my home over a tree I never wanted cut down? What dark secrets was this seemingly perfect neighborhood hiding behind its manicured lawns and matching mailboxes? My hands were shaking as I pushed open the glass doors to the community center. The monthly HOA meeting was already underway, with about 30 neighbors seated in neat rows, facing the board members at their elevated table. I spotted Mrs. Peterson in the front row, her platinum blonde hair styled in that perfect bob. That probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Excuse me, I said loudly, interrupting Richard mid-sentence about new pool regulations. I need to address the board about an urgent matter. Every head turned. Some neighbors looked away quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others stared with open curiosity. I'd never spoken up at these meetings before. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. We have a procedure for bringing up new business. You needed to submit your request 2 weeks in advance. I think destroying my property without permission jumps to the front of the line, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. The room went completely silent. Mrs. Peterson stood up, her designer purse clutched tightly. That eyesore was dropping leaves and branches into my yard for years. My husband nearly broke his ankle last fall. Please sit down, Margaret, Richard said smoothly. Sir, if you have a complaint, you can fill out the proper form and… I already filled out your forms, 3 times. I moved to the center of the room, and while I was waiting for a response that never came, you sent people to cut down my tree without my permission, and now you're suing me for the damage your people caused? A few neighbors whispered to each other. I noticed Tom in the back giving me a thumbs up. Richard's face hardened. That tree was clearly in violation of HOA landscaping guidelines. Section 8, paragraph 3, which states nothing about trees that predate the HOA's existence. Came a calm voice from behind me. Diana Ross walked in, carrying a leather briefcase. She looked every bit the powerhouse attorney in her navy suit. I'd found her through Tom's recommendation. She specialized in property disputes and had fought HOAs before. And you are? Richard asked, clearly annoyed by another interruption. Diana Ross, attorney at law. I represent the homeowner whose property rights were violated when this board authorized the destruction of a mature maple tree valued at approximately $15,000. Mrs. Peterson scoffed loudly. $15,000 for that ugly tree? Ridiculous. Diana smiled slightly. Actually, that's a conservative estimate from our arborist. Mature trees increase property values substantially, which I'm sure this board is aware of, given your focus on community standards. I stepped forward and placed my property survey on the projector. The digital image showed my lot lines clearly, with the maple tree positioned 2 feet inside my boundary. As you can see, I explained to the room, pointing at the diagram, the tree was completely on my property. The HOA had no right to touch it. The room erupted in murmurs. A woman in back called out, Richard, is this true? Was the tree on private property? Richard's face flushed red. The survey must be outdated. Our landscaping jurisdiction extends. Your jurisdiction ends at my property line, I said firmly. And I have the original survey from when the house was built, plus a recent one I had done last year when I installed the garden shed. Both show the same boundaries. Mrs. Peterson stood up again. This is absurd. That tree was a menace. It blocked my view of the sunset. My property values were suffering. Diana raised an eyebrow. Interesting you should mention property values, Mrs. Peterson, because cutting down a neighbor's Tree without permission is actually a criminal offense in this state, and the HOA board authorizing it could constitute conspiracy. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man named Jenkins, whispered something to Richard. Richard waved him off impatiently. We acted in good faith based on multiple complaints, Richard insisted. The tree posed a safety risk. Then why didn't you get an arborist's report saying so? I asked. I have an assessment from last spring that certified the tree was healthy. I handed copies of the report to each board member. Several neighbors stood up to get a better look. Richard glanced at it and tossed it aside. This changes nothing. The tree fell and damaged Mrs. Peterson's property. You're responsible for the damage as the tree's owner. Diana smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Actually, when someone improperly cuts a tree and causes it to fall, they assume liability for any resulting damage. Your contractors cut the tree incorrectly, against the property owner's wishes, which directly caused the branch to fall. Mrs. Peterson's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. This is ridiculous. Richard, do something! Another neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, who I barely knew, stood up. I'd like to know why the board approved cutting down a tree on private property without the owner's consent. That doesn't seem right. Richard banged his gavel. This discussion is over. We'll address this matter privately with the parties involved. Actually, Diana said, my client would prefer transparency, which is why we've prepared this. She handed documents to each board member. This is our countersuit for the tree's value, emotional damages and trespassing. The room erupted. Several neighbors crowded around to see the documents. I noticed some of them were taking pictures with their phones. You can't sue the HOA! Richard shouted, standing up. Your HOA agreement specifically states that all disputes must go through our arbitration process first. Diana smiled again. I've reviewed that agreement carefully. It doesn't cover criminal trespass or destruction of property. Additionally, we've filed a police report regarding the unauthorized entry and property damage. The color drained from Richard's face. Mrs. Peterson looked like she might faint. This meeting is adjourned, Richard declared, banging his gavel repeatedly. As people began filing out, many neighbors approached me with sympathetic comments. They've gone too far this time, one elderly man told me. That board thinks they own everything. As Diana and I walked toward the exit, Richard caught up to us in the hallway. His friendly public persona had vanished. You don't know who you're dealing with, he hissed, grabbing my arm tightly. I have connections in this town that can make your life miserable. Diana calmly removed his hand from my arm. That sounds remarkably like a threat. Mr. Thornton, would you care to rephrase that with witnesses present? Richard stepped back, straightening his tie. I'm simply advising your client that fighting the HOA is a losing battle. Everyone who's tried has regretted it. As we walked to the parking lot, I felt a mix of triumph and dread. What happens next? I asked Diana. They'll try to intimidate you into dropping the countersuit, she said. Stand firm. I've seen bullies like Richard before. They fold when challenged properly. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent the previous night researching Richard Thornton online. His construction company had several complaints filed against it. And oddly enough, that same company seemed to get all the maintenance contracts for our HOA. And when I dug deeper, I found something that made my blood run cold. Something about Richard's connections that would change everything about this fight. The doorbell rang at 7:15 a.m. I opened it, still in my pajamas, to find Detective Rodriguez holding 2 coffee cups. Mind if I come in? This couldn't wait, she said, her face serious. You might want to sit down for this. My hands shook as I took the coffee. Just yesterday, I'd filed what I thought was a simple police report about my cut-down tree. Now a detective was in my kitchen before breakfast. Your HOA president, Mr. Thornton? His name set off alarm bells across 3 departments. Detective Rodriguez said, pulling out a thick folder. We've been watching his construction company for nearly a year. I leaned forward. Because of my tree? Your tree was just the tip of the iceberg, she said, spreading photos across the table. See these maintenance trucks at your community center last summer? Thornton Construction, right? They billed your HOA $65,000 for emergency roof repairs. That should have cost $20,000 tops. My jaw dropped. That's why our fees went up last year. Richard said it was insurance costs. It gets worse, Detective Rodriguez continued, showing me paperwork with highlighted sections. Every single maintenance contract in Oak Ridge Estates for the past 5 years has gone to Thornton Construction. No competitive bids, no board oversight. Just Richard signing checks to his own company. But that's illegal, I exclaimed. How could nobody notice? Fear and friendship, she said simply. The board members who might object suddenly find themselves facing violation notices or pushed out. The ones who stay quiet get perks, like Mrs. Peterson's new fencing that normally violates HOA rules but somehow got special approval. I thought about all the neighbors who'd moved away after fights with the HOA. It wasn't just about strict Rules. It was about who you knew. Speaking of Mrs. Peterson, Detective Rodriguez pulled out another folder. Did you know her husband works for the city? Everyone knows Bob Peterson is on some board. I shrugged. Not just any board. He's on the zoning commission that approved Richard's controversial Westlake development last year, the one that got rushed through despite environmental concerns. My mind raced. So when Mrs. Peterson complained about my tree, she wasn't just being picky. Your property backs up to the creek that feeds into Westlake. Richard's development is having drainage issues. Their environmental consultants have been looking for someone to blame for supposed water contamination. I jumped up, nearly knocking over my coffee. That's why they wanted my tree gone. To take soil samples. Smart, Detective Rodriguez nodded. The tree removal company told us they were specifically instructed to dig out as much of the root system as possible, which is unusual unless they wanted access to the soil underneath, I finished. I pulled out my phone to show her the strange holes I'd found in my backyard. After the tree cutting, I thought it was from the tree company, but they were too perfectly spaced. Rodriguez examined the photos closely. They were testing your soil, looking for anything they could pin on you. But my tree couldn't possibly be causing problems for a development 2 miles downstream. It doesn't have to be true, she said. It just has to be plausible enough for Richard to get the city inspectors, who might owe favors to Bob Peterson, to issue violations. Enough violations, and you might be forced to sell. My stomach dropped. They want my property? Your lot sits at a critical drainage point. If Richard's company controls it, they can redirect blame for any environmental issues away from their development. I paced around my kitchen, my mind spinning. So this whole lawsuit about Mrs. Peterson's gazebo, a distraction. They need you financially drained and stressed, so you'll give up and move. What about the other neighbors? Tom has been helping me fight this. Detective Rodriguez's expression darkened. Tom submitted 3 complaints about suspicious HOA accounting last year, all mysteriously lost by the board secretary. So what do we do now? I asked. She closed her folders. This has gone beyond a local police matter. The money involved crosses state lines, because your HOA uses a management company in Nevada. I've contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division. The FBI? I whispered, suddenly feeling the weight of what we were uncovering. This is bigger than your tree or even Oak Ridge Estates. Richard's company has contracts with 6 other HOAs in the county. We're looking at potentially millions in fraudulent billing, kickbacks, bribes to city officials. My phone pinged with an email notification. The color drained from my face as I read it. What is it? Detective Rodriguez asked. The HOA just placed a lien on my house for unpaid emergency assessments of $12,000, I said, my voice shaking. How can they do that without even notifying me first? Detective Rodriguez reached for her phone. This changes things. They're moving faster than we expected. What do you mean? Putting a lien on your property is their first step to force a sale. I need to call my supervisor and the FBI contact immediately. As she stepped outside to make her call, I stared at the documents scattered across my kitchen table. Photos of Richard shaking hands with city officials, spreadsheets showing inflated contracts, maps of the Westlake development with my properties circled in red. My quiet life had been upended because I stood up for a tree. Now I was caught in the middle of what appeared to be a small-town corruption ring involving my neighbors, the HOA, and city officials. Through the window, I spotted Mrs. Peterson standing near my mailbox, talking on her phone while staring directly at my house. When she saw me watching, she didn't look away. Instead, she smiled and waved, as if daring me to make my next move. Detective Rodriguez returned, her expression grim. The FBI wants to move quickly, but they need more evidence. Can you attend the HOA meeting tonight and record it without being obvious? We need to hear how Richard explains this lien to the other homeowners. Won't that be dangerous if they're already targeting me? We'll have plainclothes officers nearby, she assured me. But you need to act normal, like you're just fighting the tree issue, not onto their bigger scheme. As she gathered her documents, Detective Rodriguez paused. One more thing. Has anyone unusual been around your house lately? Workers, delivery people you didn't expect? A chill ran down my spine. The cable company came yesterday, but I didn't call them. They said they were doing routine maintenance. Her eyes narrowed. Show me where they worked. I led her to the living room where the cable box was located. She pulled out a small device and waved it around the television and cable equipment. It began beeping rapidly near the cable box. Just as I thought, she said quietly, showing me a tiny black device hidden behind my cable box. They're listening to you. The question now is, what else do they know about what we know? I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. Someone had thrown a rock through my living room window with a note wrapped around it. Leave now or worse will come. My hands shook as I called the police, but I knew exactly who was behind this. The neighborhood I once loved had turned into a battlefield overnight. Fourth incident this week, Officer Jenkins said, taking photos of the broken glass. You really stirred up a hornet's nest with these HOA folks. I hadn't just stirred it. I was getting stung from every direction. The day after I received the court papers about the lien on my house, Mrs. Peterson transformed into a one-woman army against me. She stood at the end of my driveway each morning, taking pictures of my house and writing notes. When I tried to talk to her, she turned her back and walked away. You're going to wish you never moved here, she finally hissed at me yesterday. Nobody goes against the HOA and wins. I decided to fight back with information. Tom helped me create flyers showing the actual property survey and photos of the HOA hired workers cutting down my tree without permission. We placed them on every doorstep in the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson responded by calling an emergency HOA meeting at her house, and only invited people who were on her side. Through my kitchen window, I watched as 20 neighbors filed into her oversized colonial home across the street. Not a single one looked my way. The next morning, I found my mailbox knocked over and crushed. 3 other neighbors who had shown me support discovered their car tires slashed. This isn't about a tree anymore, Tom said, helping me set up my new security camera system. They're scared of what you might find out. The cameras were against HOA rules about exterior modifications without approval, but at this point, I didn't care. Within hours of installing them, a new violation letter appeared on my door, threatening a $100 daily fine for each camera. I was eating dinner that night when my phone buzzed with a security alert. On my screen, I watched in disbelief as Richard Thornton himself, along with 2 board members I recognized from meetings, entered my backyard carrying small tools and plastic bags. They moved with purpose, taking samples from the soil near where my tree had stood. One of them pulled out what looked like a testing kit and seemed excited by whatever results he saw. They high-fived each other before sneaking away through the side gate. I called Diana immediately and sent her the footage. They're absolutely desperate, she said after watching it. They're trying to manufacture evidence of soil contamination to force you out on environmental grounds. This is crossing into criminal trespassing. I couldn't sleep that night. Every car that drove by made me jump. I kept replaying Detective Rodriguez's words in my head about Richard's company being under investigation. This wasn't just about a tree or even about HOA rules anymore. Something much bigger was at stake. The next morning, I found bright orange environmental hazard signs staked around the perimeter of my yard. Neighbors walking their dogs crossed to the other side of the street to avoid my house. One woman actually covered her child's face as they hurried past. Mrs. Peterson stood in her driveway, pointing at my house, while talking to an elderly couple who nodded along with concerned faces. When she spotted me watching, she smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind a predator gives when cornering its prey. I called Detective Rodriguez to update her on what was happening. This is moving faster than we expected, she said, her voice tense. They're trying to force you out before we can complete our investigation. Agent Patel from the FBI needs to meet with you today. 3 hours later, I sat at my kitchen table across from Agent Patel, a serious woman with quick eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed my security footage and photographs of the signs. We've been building a case against Thornton's company for months, she explained. Money laundering through inflated HOA maintenance contracts, kickbacks, bribes to city officials. Your tree dispute accidentally shined a light on their operation, and now they're scrambling. So what do I do? I asked, feeling both relieved that this wasn't all in my head, and terrified about being caught in something so dangerous. We need you to continue acting normally, Agent Patel instructed. Don't let them know we're building a case. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. I agreed, but maintaining normal became impossible that afternoon when 5 official-looking people in hazmat suits showed up to take more soil samples from my yard. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, watching and whispering. Mrs. Peterson moved among them, nodding gravely and pointing toward my house. It's worse than we thought, I overheard her say loudly. The contamination could affect the whole neighborhood's water supply. Our children could get sick. The hazmat team, which I strongly suspected was fake, placed more warning signs around my property. A news van pulled up, and Mrs. Peterson rushed over to speak with a reporter before I could get outside. By evening, my phone was blowing up with texts from concerned neighbors I hadn't heard from in weeks, all suddenly worried about toxic chemicals under my house. At 9 p.m., a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. Inside was a notice that the HOA had scheduled an emergency vote in 2 days to begin legal proceedings to force me to sell my house and leave the neighborhood immediately. The document cited imminent environmental danger, continuous rule violations, and, most absurdly, hostile actions against HOA leadership. I called Diana, who answered despite the late hour. They're panicking, she said after I read her the notice. This vote is completely outside their authority, but that won't stop them from trying to intimidate you and turn the neighborhood against you. As we were talking, another security alert buzzed on my phone. I switched to the camera app and froze. Richard and Mrs. Peterson were at my front door, placing something against it. I watched in real time as Mrs. Peterson pulled out a marker and wrote on a large poster before taping it to my door. When they left, I cautiously opened the door to find a crude sign. Toxic resident, neighborhood. Vote Thursday 7 p.m. Your last chance to leave with dignity. I went back inside and emailed the new footage to Agent Patel. Within minutes, she called back. This changes our timeline, she said firmly. We need to move before this vote happens. Can you attend the meeting and record everything? I'll be there, I promised. A mix of fear and determination settling in my stomach. What I didn't know then was that Mrs. Peterson had already convinced the city inspector, her husband's poker buddy, to come declare my house unsafe for occupancy the very next morning. My stomach twisted into knots as I walked into the packed community center. Everyone turned to stare at me, some with pity, others with hate in their eyes. Mrs. Peterson sat in the front row wearing her signature pearl necklace, nudging her friends and pointing at me with a smug smile on her face. She'd spent all week calling neighbors to make sure they showed up to vote me out. That's the troublemaker, she whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Can you believe he's still fighting after what his tree did to my beautiful gazebo? I took a deep breath and found a seat in the back row, just like Agent Patel had told me to do. My hands were shaking so bad I had to stuff them in my pockets. The agent had given me a special pen that was actually a recording device, and I worried everyone could see it sticking out of my shirt pocket. Richard Thornton strolled to the front of the room like he owned the place, tapping the microphone 3 times. He wore an expensive suit and that fake smile that never reached his eyes. Good evening, neighbors and friends, he announced, scanning the room until his gaze landed on me. His smile dropped for just a second. Tonight we face a serious threat to our community's safety and property values. On the big screen behind him, a picture of my house popped up. People gasped when they saw the security cameras I'd installed. As you can see, one resident continues to defy our rules, Richard continued, clicking to show more pictures. Unauthorized surveillance equipment. Failure to clean up after the dangerous tree removal. And now, he paused for effect. We have evidence of something even more disturbing. The next slide showed Richard and his buddies in my backyard at night, digging up soil samples. Of course, he didn't mention they were trespassing. Our tests show concerning levels of contaminants that could affect the entire neighborhood's water supply, Richard announced gravely. The room filled with worried whispers. Mrs. Peterson stood up without being called on. I told everyone that property was trouble from the start. My little Pomeranian won't even walk on that side of the street anymore. Animals can sense these things. I wanted to jump up and defend myself. But Agent Patel's instructions echoed in my head. Don't react. Let them dig their own hole deeper. Tom, my only ally on the block, raised his hand. Could we see those soil test results? And who performed them? Richard waved him off. My company has specialists for this sort of thing. The technical details aren't important right now. Seems convenient, Tom muttered, but most people ignored him. Richard clicked to another slide, showing a copy of the HOA bylaws with certain sections highlighted in red. According to Section 23, Paragraph C, the board can vote to begin eviction proceedings against any homeowner who presents a clear and present danger to community welfare. Mrs. Peterson nodded enthusiastically. It's for the safety of our children. I looked around at my neighbors, people I'd waved to every morning for 5 years. Most avoided eye contact. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody else spoke up. Richard continued, his voice growing more confident. Before we vote, I should mention that fighting this action will be expensive and futile. Our HOA has the full backing of my company's legal team. He didn't notice the community center's back door opening slightly. A woman in casual clothes slipped in and sat down. Detective Rodriguez, pretending to be late. Now then, Richard said, all in favor of beginning eviction proceedings. The main doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. 3 people in dark blue jackets with FBI in bold yellow letters walked in, followed by 4 others carrying boxes and briefcases. What is the meaning of this interruption? Richard sputtered, his face turning red. We're in the middle of an important community vote. Agent Patel stepped forward, holding up a badge. Richard Thornton. I'm Special Agent Patel with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We have federal warrants to search all HOA financial records, your business documents and electronic devices. The room exploded with voices. Mrs. Peterson leapt to her feet, her pearl necklace bouncing against her chest. This is outrageous. Richard is a respected businessman. Agent Patel ignored her, motioning to his team. We also have warrants for Margaret Peterson, James Jenkins, and Sarah Williams as board members engaged in this activity. Mrs. Peterson's face went from angry red to ghost white in seconds. This is all a misunderstanding. I barely look at the financial reports. Richard lunged for his laptop, but an agent was already there. Sir, please step away from the computer. Attempting to destroy evidence is a separate federal offense. Evidence of what? Someone called out from the crowd. Detective Rodriguez stood up. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA has been under investigation for 6 months. We have reason to believe over $1 million of homeowner fees have been embezzled through fraudulent contracts. The crowd's shock was like a physical wave through the room. Neighbors turned to each other, mouths hanging open. That's why our fees kept going up, shouted Mr. Johnson from across the room. I can barely afford the $600 a month. Mrs. Peterson tried to push past an agent toward the exit. I need to check on my dog. Ma'am, please remain seated, the agent said firmly. Richard composed himself, straightening his tie. My attorneys will clear this up immediately. This is clearly a vindictive action orchestrated by, he pointed at me, that troublemaker who refused to follow our reasonable rules. I finally stood up and all eyes turned to me. My voice was steadier than I expected. The tree was just the beginning, I said clearly. When they came after me, I started asking questions, looking at public records, following the money. I pulled out copies of the contracts I'd found showing Richard's company charging the HOA triple the normal rate for simple repairs. They've been stealing from all of us for years. Lies, Mrs. Peterson shrieked, but her voice cracked. Tom stood up beside me. Is it a lie that your husband approved? Richard's development project right after the HOA gave his company an exclusive landscaping contract. Mrs. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. An agent opened one of Richard's files on the podium computer, projecting it onto the screen. It showed a spreadsheet with all our names, addresses, and notes about which residents might cause compliance issues. Next to my name was written, target for removal, property, needed for detention pond expansion. What's a detention pond? Someone asked. Agent Patel stepped forward. It's a requirement for Mr. Thornton's new development, project 3 blocks over. Without it, he can't build his condos. According to these documents, he planned to force several of you out to create space for it. The room descended into chaos. Neighbors who had ignored me for months suddenly crowded around with questions and apologies. Mrs. Peterson sat alone, abandoned by her friends, staring at her hands. Richard was being read his rights in the corner. As the FBI began interviewing residents one by one, I stepped outside for fresh air. The night was quiet except for distant sirens. I looked down my street at all the identical houses with their perfect lawns. For the first time in months, I felt like I might actually get to keep mine.